If you've listened to Brewlosophy at all, you know how much we love Imperial Yeast. The company was founded on the ideal that if you're going to do something, do it right. From their Imperial Pitch-Right pouches, packing a whopping 200 billion cells of healthy and viable yeast in each pouch, to their commitment to commercial customers, guaranteeing 10 of their most popular strains are in stock for orders up to 20 liters, or the shipping is free, Imperial Yeast does it right. No more worrying about whether you need to make a starter or propagate your yeast prior to pitching. Imperial Yeast makes it easy for the home brewer and commercial brewer to obtain direct pitches at proper rates when you need it. To place a commercial order or to get more information about everything that Imperial Yeast has to offer, head on over to imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. There are new reports out this week, just like seemingly every week, that the world is getting warmer. These increases in temperatures place an inordinate burden on agricultural systems like barley and hops, two of the main ingredients in beer. So what are growers, brewers, and scientists to do in the face of these global challenges? I'm your host, Cade Job, and today I'm back in the lab with my co-host, Jordan Folks, as we apply the science from last week's episode, Barley and Climate Change, with Drs. Campbell Morrissey and Harmony Bettenhausen.
You know, I think brewers have always been good at adapting, whether it be ingredients or methods or systems. And clearly, this is just one other element that we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to and be ready to adapt.
Yeah, right. I mean, adaptation. Certainly a topic that we talked about last week that Campbell and Harmony and I talked about. But I totally right. And again, there is cause for hope, right? I mean, that was one of the things that we spent a lot of time focusing on last week with climate and barley is that, yeah, things are changing, but we can adapt, and there's still a lot of levers that we can pull in the brewery to help, alleviate some of these raw ingredient impacts. But there's lots going on, and we're indirectly impacted by the things that are actually happening to growers. It all trickles down. And so as brewers, there are lots of opportunities to be more efficient in our processes, and focusing on sustainability is also a fun one to chase. So Jordan and I thought, hey, let's spend some time doing that. Let's talk about sustainability and see if we can trace it through the brewing process, give you some ideas on improving and becoming a more sustainable brewer. But first, if you're not already a patron of Brewlosophy, please consider becoming one. We really appreciate the support we get from our patrons, and as a reward, of course, you get access to unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. Becoming a patron is easy. There's no obligation. You can cancel at any time, but if you're out there listening to this show, I really hope you'll check it out. Perhaps make it the start of a New Year's resolution. Start contributing and taking advantage of the rewards. And of course, we're starting the new year out with a bang, hosting Brad Ring, president and editor of Brew Your Own magazine, to answer Patreon questions in January. So everything you need to know to become a patron is listed at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, so please check it out. Another great way to support us is by using the links at brewlosophy.com/support. There's some really cool affiliates who give us a small kickback if you purchase from their site by using one of Brewlosophy's links. It doesn't change any part of your shopping experience, but it does help us out, so head over to brewlosophy.com/support to check it out. All right, this week's feedback is brought to you by the dedicated crew at Haas, who bred Sabro from a Neo-Mexicanus subspecies growing wild in the mountains of New Mexico. Think you know Sabro? Think again. This monster of a hop is efficient when it comes to delivering big flavor. Use less green to save more green, if you know what I mean. And if you like pina coladas and getting caught in the rain, try it in the Whirlpool. It's full of aroma and chemical compounds that last from the hot side to the final glass, even if you dry hop on top of it. Sabro is known for its incredible blend of coconut, tropical, and stone fruits with a pronounced cream character with flavors of vanilla, cedar, dill, and even mint. And can't decide where to use it? No sweat. Sabro's available in all Haas hop formats, ready to meet your brewing needs, from highly consistent Lupamax pellets to efficient Incognito, and of course traditional T90 pellets. Learn more about this awesome variety as well as the other innovative products Haas has to offer at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, HAAS.com. All right, this week's feedback comes from listener Tim from Surrey in the UK. He says, hey, my name's Tim from Surrey in the UK. I wanted to reply to the feedback you got for episode 139 of the Brew Lab and the purging of kegs for packaging. I wanted to suggest my method, as I've been doing it for a while and I've not noticed any bad effects. It may be worth exploring and would be great to get tested. I used to do the fill with sanitizer, then push out with CO2, but I got lazy. Now I hook up a cleaned empty keg to my pressure fermenter, going in through the dip tube from the start of fermentation, and put a spunding valve on the keg gas post and let the duration of fermentation push CO2 through the keg to flush the oxygen out from the bottom. I figured so much CO2 is produced, it should do the job. This saves on canisters of CO2 and sanitizer, and I purge my transfer lines too. What do you think? Also, I'd like to mention, are you guys aware of the new Kegland yellow corny kegs and yellow corny keg O-rings that are non-silicone based? Kegland did a test on the silicone O-rings and said they were permeable to oxygen. So thanks for all you guys do for homebrewing. What do you think, Jordan?
I love this comment. As someone that's very afraid of oxygen, and I'm always interested in new, better ways to mitigate oxygen when packaging, as well as more sustainable and easier ways. That being said, I think there might be an opportunity for improvement here, because I think that you can take this kind of like set it and forget it method, but just filling the keg with either water or sanitizer, in my opinion, a non-foaming sanitizer, could arguably make this even better, because the CO2 from fermentation is pushing that. You would need a third keg, of course, but it's pushing that liquid out into a third receiving keg and then really displacing any oxygen that could be in the keg. So that would be my concern, is that just using CO2 to purge is not as good of a job as we could do. That being said, Marshall talked a lot about this a couple years ago, and that was his method for purging the receiving keg. And it certainly worked for him. But one thing I never understood is, how do you prevent the third keg from becoming a messy blow off? I guess it's just there's only 5 gallons, and it's going out through the outpost anyway. The gas inpost. So there's not really enough to overflow. Have you ever done it yourself?
I have actually done this twice. Yes. I've done this method 2 times, and I love this method. In my opinion, it's great. And let me back up. I should say I did it the way that you just suggested. I had 2 kegs in line from my fermenter. One of them was filled with CO2, and then the other one was connected and empty, right? Totally empty, but had a poppet on it, not a spunding valve, just a poppet to depress the gas release. And exactly what you said happened. So the pressure the CO2 from fermentation pushed all of the liquid sanitizer over into the second keg. In this case, I've got my fermenter and 2 kegs, pushed all the liquid over, and then that middle keg was pressurized lightly, like 1 or 2 psi from fermentation, which was really awesome. And one thing I did this several times, and I loved it. I was like, man, this seems like a really great idea. I need to do this. The problem is I'm usually fermenting 2 batches at once, or sometimes 2 experiments, which would mean I'd have my big 14-gallon fermenter in there and then 2 6-gallon fermenters in there. And if I have that in my fermentation chamber, there's no way I can fit another 4 kegs in there. It's really tight if I do just my 2 5-gallon 20-liter fermenters and 4 kegs. That's pretty tight in my fermentation chamber. So I was pretty space limited, and that's why I stopped doing that procedure. But I'd love for somebody to actually measure what is the gas concentration in that keg, right? If you just had it empty, if you just did an empty keg, like you said, Jordan, one of the things I'd be worried about is most of it is going to be CO2, because there's just a sheer volume of CO2 that's pushing in there, and things are going to push out. But how much oxygen is actually left in the keg, right? If you're not using sanitizer to push it through. That would be my question too. And I'd love for somebody to measure this. Do you know if we ever did an experiment looking at this, as a viable, purging your keg method?
I don't think we have. And, one thing that makes me wonder is whether there is some sort of impact because of head pressure, right? They say that, how do they measure pressure again? Feet of water or something?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't remember. My food engineering professor is probably screaming right now if he would be listening to this. But yeah, I don't remember.
Right. And so they say that excess head pressure can affect fermentation, right? And not necessarily it won't happen, but it could suppress esters or extract more. I don't know. And so I wonder if that surely would be a ton of pressure on the quote airlock, because it's 5 gallons of liquid as opposed to 5 teaspoons that it's in a normal airlock.
Right.
So that's an interesting thing to test to see if there is some sort of impact on both like the oxygen scavenging impact as well as the effect of the extra head pressure on fermentation. Getting to the other question about these yellow corny keg O-rings, I have not heard of these. I'm super excited. I definitely want to pick some up. Seems like one more tool in the toolkit to mitigate oxygen, and Kegland makes great stuff, and this is a really cheap piece of insurance and a little cheap upgrade.
Yeah, absolutely. This one, I had heard of it as well. I'm excited to test it out, and heck, if it works, I'm going to replace them on all of my kegs, because why not, right? I mean, if the silicone is a source of oxygen, absolutely want to replace that. But yeah, so Tim, thanks for sharing the feedback. Awesome. All right, after the short break, we'll be back chasing sustainability through the brewing process. The dry yeast revolution is here, and Cellar Science is leading the charge. Cellar Science has expanded the world of dry yeast far beyond the drab landscape of yesteryear. With over 20 strains of beer and wine yeast now available, you can brew any style. Not to mention that their unique growth and harvesting process greatly increases lipid levels in yeast cell walls, removing the need to aerate your wort on the first pitch and allowing you to directly pitch without rehydration. Couple that with the other advantages of dry yeast, such as higher cell count and viability, and you can clearly see why commercial breweries across the U.S. are using dry yeast and choosing Cellar Science. For a while there, it seemed like everyone was talking about sustainability, talking about hitting water efficiency metrics, CO2 recapture, cutting back and upcycling waste, reusing materials. Then the pandemic hit, and it seems people had to adjust their priorities, particularly in brewing. When the costs started to go up, ingredients started to be difficult to find, those sustainability decisions maybe got put on the back burner a little bit. But Jordan, are there ways that brewers might be more sustainable without breaking the bank, or these sort of cost considerations?
Well, you always want the sustainability solution to solve more problems than it causes, right? And so in theory, there should be an ROI on sustainability investments, at least as it relates to energy use. So if you have some sort of upgrade that uses less electricity or natural gas or whatever it is that you use to, fire your brew kettle, or some sort of upgrade that helps you use less CO2, there should be real cost savings. So since, the scientific episodes that you have with brewing scientists describing their work are really focused on the professional brewing setting, I thought it might be nice for us to kind of talk about it from a home brewing setting. What can we do at the homebrew level to chase sustainability? Because clearly the equation's a lot different in your garage than it is at a 30-barrel brew house.
Yeah, totally. And on that comment, right, to piggyback off of what you were just saying, right, I heard a brewer say this at one time at a conference, and he said, for sustainability decisions to make sense for a brewery, it can't add cost. It can't, right? It can, if it feels good and is net neutral, then that's great, right? But it can't add a cost to it. And so this idea of an ROI on sustainability, I think, is a really interesting concept. And we've had a whole bunch of different, episodes on this topic, talking about brewing with green malt, or chasing sustainability in your brewery, or, electrifying parts of your brewery, heat recovery, all these other options that are available to breweries. And again, the main takeaway is, yeah, I can put solar panels on my brewery and power my brewery through green, through solar energy, instead of relying on, grids and all this other stuff, and coal and potentially other sources of energy. But those solar panels are expensive, and it's a huge capital outlay to put the solar panels on there. And I have to make sure that doesn't bankrupt my brewery because I'm chasing this green. And to your point, those concerns, most home brewers don't have them. Right? I mean, most homebrewers are like, hey, if I can chase sustainability, that's kind of fun. I think of all the times that we've had people say, oh, I'm trying to hit this efficiency level, right? It'd be fun to chase sustainability too. Like, how can I reduce the amount of water that I'm using during brewing? Because I know for sure, whenever the chiller is running and that water is just spilling out onto the pavement in my driveway, or like running into my garden or something like that, I'm going, man, that's a lot of water that's just being dumped someplace, or rinsing for cleaning and cleansing. So yeah, I love this idea, and I think that's what we should do. So we'll start the first half of the show talking about like hot side, and then finish up the show talking about cold side. But I think, especially in light of last week's episode, talking with Harmony and Campbell, we got to start with raw ingredients, right?
Totally. And this is the one thing that it actually could go either direction, in that choosing more sustainable ingredients might cost more and there might not be an ROI. But if we think with our, zombie apocalypse goggles on, there could be a world in which this is no longer a luxury or some sort of virtue signaling, but an absolute necessity. And so that's one thing I like to think about here, is as we chase sustainability, how would we do this in a zombie apocalypse? How would we do this in a more aggressive climate future where you really don't have a choice and you have to adapt? And so I think starting with ingredients makes sense. So there's a few different ingredients, of course, in the brewing process, largely malt or grains, hops, yeast, and water. And so why don't we start with malt? So there are a few different types of grains that are malted. Barley is typically the most commonly used malt ingredient in the brew house. But as I understand it, barley is a fairly water-intensive crop. What do you know about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I learned about it last week from Campbell, right? I mean, this water is a big deal, especially for hops too, right? Barley is often irrigated in the United States, which I guess kind of makes sense, right? A lot of crops are irrigated, but he said that only Montana and South Dakota are the only places that actually produce significant quantities of dry land barley. So barley that's not actually irrigated, which is, so I find this whole concept sort of interesting, right? I mean, I was talking with Selena DeGula in episode 49, brewing with green malt. And so green malt is malt that has been steeped and germinated at the malt house, but not kilned. Right? So you can use the germinated malt that's got all the enzyme power. It's ready to go and be brewed with. But then we do this thing called kilning. So let's take a step back. You've got barley, you put it in the ground. And if you're not living in Montana or South Dakota, you have to water it. So then you have to put a whole bunch of water in the ground so that the barley grows, right? Then we harvest the barley. And if we harvest it too wet, then we may have to dry it or we can't put it in storage. If we put it in storage and it's wet, that barley is going to start growing and fermenting and potentially spontaneously combust, which would be a bad thing, right? So often barley has to get dried some way or set somewhere so that it can dry when it comes out of the field. Then it gets trucked or shipped over to a maltster where a whole bunch of water is added back to it. It gets steeped for like 24 hours to raise that water content back up. Then it germinates and then we kiln it, taking all the water back out again. And then it comes to the brew house and we add a whole bunch of water during the mash, right? To get it like all wet. There's so many times that we're adding water in and then taking water out of barley and then adding water in and taking it out. Like, wow, how inefficient of a process that whole thing is.
Exactly. And so I think that focusing on malt varieties that require less processing and irrigation is one such way to be more sustainable. So using dryland barleys, also, unmalted varieties, like going really old school and using like a big proportion of unmalted wheat, because that malting process uses energy. And so you're taking some of the CO2 out of your brew, not the carbon dioxide that makes it fizzy, but the CO2 implications of your brew by using an unmalted product like unmalted wheat. So I think that focusing on local and more sustainable crops is one such way that we can make our brewing more efficient in terms of the environmental, effect. That being said, that might be looking at craft malt, and that might mean a higher price point.
Yeah, exactly. And craft malt was an interesting one too. And Campbell made this comment, which I thought was really interesting, which is that local maltsters, craft maltsters, can actually help global supply chains, right? And I was like, I thought about that and I was like, wait a minute, what are you talking about there? But then he explained it really well. It said, like, look, there's, one of the biggest costs for maltsters is transportation. It's moving the barley around everywhere. Because remember too, we use, in terms of volume of ingredient, right? We use a ton of barley, like way more barley than we do hops or yeast. right? Hops is a very low, if you just look at like the total pound or weight, the total mass of what you use, we're talking huge volumes of malt and barley that has to get shipped around somewhere. So these craft and local malts can build the supply chain, meaning that like now becomes a supply and we don't have to pay increased transportation costs to get to this area. You're not driving up the cost of barley. You now have something that's local and usable. But there's also a really cool benefit of craft and local malts is a little bit of this terroir character, right? I mean, I think that's a really cool upside too. I mean, I know you have a lot of experience brewing with local malts. I know you brewed with Mecca Grade for a while, and you've been looking at Admiral and some of those other places, right?
Yeah, I love the idea of a local brew. And my kind of dream is to use local hops, local malt, local water, and wild captured yeast. There's a spring on the way to the coast out here. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. And it has really awesome pure water just for free flowing on the side of the road. And people will drive up from Portland and fill several carboys and then take it back and drink it all week. I even heard a rumor that there was a guy driving up from the Bay Area filling a truck up with it and then selling it for like $10 a bottle to tech bros. I don't know if that's real or not, but it's really awesome water. And it's a cool idea to just really rely on what's literally around you. And so I guess one other thought I had related to the malt equation, and maybe we can move on to other ingredients after that, is there are other grains that one could brew with that are not barley. Obviously there's wheat, there's rye, but what about like this new stuff like Kendra or Kinza? Have you heard of this?
Kernza.
Yeah, can you? Yeah. Is there a sustainability benefit to that grain?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a hybrid grain from my understanding, and I want to get them on the show to talk about it. Just go in a little bit deeper dive of it. But yeah, there's a sustainability impact to it too. And then also, there's all kinds of research like Campbell was doing here at Oregon State University. I mean, Pat Hayes. We talked about the whole winter barley, right? That whole winter barley. Again, 2 decades ago, barley was always spring planted, and winter. We're in it right now, right, Jordan? I mean, it's the winter in the Pacific Northwest, so it's cold and it's rainy. It rains a lot. But in the summer, it doesn't rain as much. So when you plant spring barley, it goes over the summer and then you harvest it in the fall or in late summer, right? But that's the driest part of the year. If you can plant the barley in the winter and it can survive the cold, that's a big deal, right? It has to survive the cold. You can use all of the rain that's coming during this part of the year. And that's the same in a lot of places, especially in the United States, but throughout the world, there are different climate, like microclimates, that make it easier and cost less and more sustainable to brew this ingredient. So there's all this different research that's coming out looking at those things. But yeah, craft malts, winter barleys, and then potentially using less malt, using things like, unmalted grains, or using different grains that are maybe local to you. Corn and rice can be used in beer. I know that most people are like, no, all malt. I want to do only all malt. But corn and rice are ingredients that are widely grown in the United States. They're cheap and they can be used in beer. But yeah, maybe we should move on to some of the other ingredients, or we're going to get stuck talking this whole episode about ingredients. Hops, like barley, are also almost entirely irrigated in the United States. So at one time they sort of grew wild in places here when brewers brought them over and planted them, but they're now almost entirely irrigated. And like, think about Yakima. Yakima is like almost 75% of all U.S. hops are grown in Yakima Valley. That place is a desert, right? I mean, you've been to Yakima, you've seen it. There's not anything out there, right? I mean, it's desert and dry.
Yeah, it's the middle of nowhere, and it's people often, non-brewers falsely assume, oh yeah, hops. I've heard that hops are grown in the Pacific Northwest. It's very rainy there. Well, the Yakima Valley is a high desert, and it is not rainy there. I mean, it looks like an old Western movie up there. And so, indeed, they're having to water these plants. And as I understand it, there are different kind of CO2 levels associated with different crops. Some are more carbon intensive than others. Now, my question to you is that a function of pesticides or irrigation or what is that? But what was it? Is it Sabro? Is it Cashmere? One of those popular Neo-Mexicanos ones apparently is very problematic from an emission standpoint. It's something that Stan Hieronymus has talked about.
Yeah. Well, and also I had that episode with Ryan Gregory, who's the one of the agronomist. He's a hop agronomist for Hopsteiner. Steiner, and they did a whole study looking at different hop varieties. And I would encourage everybody to go listen to that episode with Ryan Gregory again from Hop Steiner. Did a whole study looking at like all these different hop varieties and measuring their CO2 impact, right? So taking the amount of fertilizer, the amount of pesticides, the amount of, I don't think it included water, but a bunch of different characteristics, and then saying, okay, let's turn this into a CO2 equivalent, and then measure which hops have the most CO2, expression or emissions. And yeah, it turns out a lot of hops, like I think Cashmere might have been one, but it's the ones that have the highest disease pressure. So the ones that are most susceptible to diseases that require the most fertilizers, those are the ones that had the highest CO2 equivalent, because the processing and making of fertilizers and antifungals and anti-disease, pesticides. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for. Those things are very high CO2 emission processes. And so, so some hops are more susceptible to those diseases and thus have a higher CO2 impact. So check out that episode and check out that research, and maybe pick some hops that aren't that don't have as high of a CO2 impact.
So I know that there are a few examples of completely organic commercial breweries in the U.S. Hopworks in Portland is one such example. And in fact, I believe that they get their yeast from Imperial Yeast for that reason, because Imperial Yeast is organic. They use organic growth media when producing their products. And I believe that organic hops were one of the biggest struggles for them, at least in the beginning of their brewery. They opened in maybe 2008, 2009 in Portland, Oregon. And I imagine that there are more organic varieties available today. But I'm curious, something like if in fact Cashmere does have a super high emissions association due to fertilizer, et cetera, does that mean that there would be certain varieties that just can't be grown organically?
Yes, yeah, and so like Aslan is another one up in Seattle that's an organic brewery, and
right, and they kick ass.
Yeah,
I went to their tap room in Seattle recently. Holy smokes, it blew me away. They're brewing incredible West Coast IPAs and lagers.
Yeah, they're doing great things up there. And I was talking with the brewers there, and they were saying, sourcing ingredients is very difficult for them. There's a lot of organic barley varieties that they can use, because barley's kind of a hardy plant, but hops are super susceptible to everything. They're susceptible to heat. They're susceptible to sunlight. They need sunlight during certain parts of the year. They need water. They need pesticides and irrigation and all this stuff. And so there are organic fungicides, pesticides, and fertilizers that you can put on hops. But again, the whole point of being organic is getting rid of all that stuff, right? Not having to use those. But hops don't grow as well. And that's a really, really big challenge. So organic, very hard to find in hops. A while ago, but it's becoming more and more popular, but also more and more expensive, because the growers don't get as high of yields whenever they grow organic. It's a different process. They have to have different chemicals, different training. You have to have different inspectors and all these things that drive up the cost of organic. So there's a lot of challenges with that, but it is an option, for the future. And of course, hop breeders, like I was talking about with Chris Willig, are talking about breeding disease resistance into hops. So CRISPR and gene editing technology could potentially allow us to identify which hop DNA sequences or genes are responsible for disease resistance, go and knock out or increase the disease resistant genes, whatever is, the problem there, and potentially breed new hop varieties that don't require as much pesticides and fertilizers. So again, hope for the future in hops.
Yeah. And so I think that an important thing to think about here is not just the CO2 emissions associated with the point source, like in the ground. It's also where it comes from and doesn't need to get on a truck or a barge or whatever. And so in terms of being as sustainable as possible, it's brew local, drink local, right? And so by using locally grown hops, you're going to have a lower carbon footprint, because there's not some sort of transport, or not as much transport associated with it. So the supreme example would be growing hops in your backyard. A little harder to do with malt, but you can totally do without hops. And even if you live in Texas, give it a try, get some Neo Mexicanas, maybe you can make this work. But if you live in the northern half of the country, becomes a lot easier to grow your own hops. And if you're listening from the U.S., use local hops. So for IPAs, we're set. We have incredible American-grown hops. Unfortunately, you'd be missing out on New Zealand varieties, which I think are really awesome additions to an IPA or a West Coast Pilsner. But we have incredible American hop varieties for the IPA side. And we have a lot of European equivalents on the noble side for lagers. So instead of Hallertau, use Mount Hood. Instead of Tettnanger, or actually let's go British, instead of Fuggle, use Willamette. There's U.S. grown Fuggle. There's U.S. grown Sots. So there's a lot of options there. And we're having higher alpha acids than Europe is right now. So that's the other thing when it comes to ingredient selection. And the same would be said for malt. Use American Pilsner malt instead of European Pilsner malt. You're going to have huge CO2 savings and cost savings because typically locally sourced products are cheaper. And so with either grains or hops, not only if you're trying to be sustainable, not only choosing local, but choosing more efficient products that you can use less of. So malts with higher diastatic power or points per gallon potential, and then hops with higher alpha acids, and maybe even concentrating more hops in the beginning of your boil so you need fewer to hit the IBUs that you desire. So really tapping into those numbers in those spec sheets to help make your brew as efficient as possible on both the malt and the hop side.
Yeah, totally. And again, some challenges that we're going to start to see, especially with barley, like Harmony was mentioning, as water and drought increase, as drought increases and water availability decreases, protein goes up, and when protein goes up, extracts go down, right? And so there's opportunities here to watch what you're doing with these different ingredients. As if you see your protein starting to go up, then maybe you can add a little bit of adjunct to your beer, add a little bit of an alternative grain or some unmalted varieties, and see if that helps out. We should also talk about water too, right? Like we're talking about water that's used to grow hops and barley, but water is also used in the brewery a lot in the brewery. And so as a raw ingredient, before we get into process use of water, we'll save that for later. But as the ingredient itself, water changes. I know there's a lot of places, especially in the United States, that their water source actually changes during different parts of the year because it gets hot or places dry out. Water's being pulled from aquifers and reservoirs and, surface water and groundwater, all these different sorts of issues. I mean, how much time do you spend thinking about the quality of the water that goes into your beer?
Luckily, I don't have to spend too much because we have really pure city water here in Portland, Oregon. I didn't filter it for the longest time, and I was making great beer. And just because why not have the insurance, I now run it through a simple RV filter. Who knows if it's actually doing much? But luckily I don't have to think about it too hard here. But just on the other side of the river in Vancouver, Washington, their water is not nearly as pure, and they have a lot more additives there. So my homebrew friends up there, they have to make RO water at home.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the deal, right? Brewing in Texas and also now here in Corvallis, I'm on a well, and in Texas, I was on a municipal water supply, but it was still from groundwater. And so that groundwater is really hard. Even though it's clean and is coming from, a supplier coming up through a well, hard water is potentially problematic for brewing. And it can also be particularly problematic for your equipment because it's, scale builds up and you have to take a little bit more effort to clean and use more water to do those sorts of things. So the water source, to me, water was, I think, the biggest improvement to my brewing practices. When I started paying attention to my water, my beers got I'm not going to say infinitely better, but they definitely got way better than they were. And these sorts of challenges have prompted some homebrewers, like you mentioned, to use RO. But one of the big challenges with RO water is that it takes about 5 gallons of waste to make 1 gallon of pure water, right? And that's a lot. So if you're making a 20-liter batch and you're going to need more than 20 liters to make a 20-liter batch, well, maybe not, maybe pretty close in your mash and stuff like that. But if you're trying to collect 20 liters or 5 gallons, that means that you're going to be wasting like 120 liters of water. Or I mean, that's crazy to think about that, like 5 times. It's just going, down the drain. It's just absolutely nuts whenever we think about the waste of RO. But the beer tastes better. So we have to make all these sort of balancing considerations, which are quite difficult in my opinion.
Right. And so if you live in a place like here in Portland with really pristine city water, it would be silly or wasteful, excessively wasteful to make RO because there's just not enough to, extract out of there. Our water reports are almost already RO, below 10 ppm of like every metric basically. And so it's nice for brewing because we're starting with a clean slate. But at the same time, we have to add salts if we want any sort of character or calcium because there isn't any in there to begin with. But if you live in a place that has just trash water, you kind of have to. So, obviously another option would be buying RO, or you could buy spring water. Or if you live in a place like me, you could go get it if you didn't have it at your home, but there was a place where you could go get it naturally, like community spring water, draft systems, if you will, because I imagine that spring water is inherently pure, right? And doesn't have the same level of waste. Maybe there's some processing, but it's not nearly as wasteful as RO.
Yeah, I actually don't know. I'm not sure how spring water is made or manufactured.
Or processed.
Yeah, processed. There you go.
Presumably it's sterilized, but hopefully not membrane filtered.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's the hard part, right? The RO process is membrane filtered. And so that's what takes so much. It takes so much water to filter off the amount that you need. And again, I don't want to like poo-poo on the people that are using RO. I'm not like shaking my fist saying, you guys are climate, destroying the climate. It is important. The water quality, again, I think it directly impacts the flavor of your beer.
But could you reuse the wastewater? Is it so gross that you couldn't even make sanitizer out of it? Or could you use it for cleaning water? Is there anything to do with the collected remnant?
Yeah, that's where I think there's got to be some optimization there, right? Surely that water's not just running down the drain. Surely it can be used later for waste, or like you said, for cleanse. Or I'm sorry, not for waste, for cleaning, right? Or for potentially boiling and I don't know. I would imagine if you need some like de-aerated wort, like we were talking about on the last episode, right? Or last Applying the Science, maybe you could make that water or use that to make de-aerated water that you could then fill your keg with and then push that out, with CO2. So something
or chilling,
like that.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Ice it down and pump that with like an aquarium pump as your chilling water or something. And so there's a lot of ways that we could chase water sustainability. In Australia, this is a big deal. And so I'm guessing Australian homebrewers are not making RO water because they're not even chilling their beer. And California has drought problems as well. So this is a very real issue of today that some homebrewers, even in this world, are having to deal with. And so definitely being sustainable on water is important. And maybe one final trick there is if you have too much calcium in your water, you could do a pre-boil and then precipitate that out. I don't know that that's enough to knock out chemicals, but there are chemical adjuncts you could use instead of RO. You could use Camden tablets for chloramines, etc. I don't know if you have any tips on that. I am not an expert in chemical adjustments because I haven't had to in my practice.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I always add Camden tablets to my water. It's kind of like an oxygen scavenger, at least I've heard as well. But then also not a huge oxygen scavenger, but a little bit. But also, like you mentioned, it's going to bind to chloramines and drop those out. So whenever I was in Texas, we're on municipal water, they were definitely using chloramines to clean the water. And most places in the United States are using those chloramines. So yeah, there's all kinds of chemical additives that you can add to the water to sort of adjust things, right? To fix it and make it where it's not as bad. Boiling to precipitate the calcium out, and boiling will also boil off chlorine, right? Also, even just like sitting out overnight, the chlorine will evaporate over the water. So if you're trying to get rid of those chemical additives and that's why you're using RO, yeah, there may be some other options. The thing I don't know and I'm just not sure about how we get around is like, being able to consistently make the same batch, when your water source is changing, and also knowing that you have the nutrients that you need, but not nutrients that are going to hurt your beer, right? Like too much hardness, too much alkalinity, too much of any of these other things that we're probably not even looking at as brewers, but that are having an adverse impact in municipal city water.
Yeah, and then, I guess there's probably like the other thing is pH adjustment, is there might be more sustainable methods of that. Like an acid rest could be one way, so you're not using a adjunct like lactic acid, if you want to call that an adjunct, to get there. Or you could, use second runnings to make your own sour gut, soured wort at home. There might be some other ways to chase efficiency there as it relates to water in terms of reduction of pH. But I think the final ingredient, which is often neglected, and it is an ingredient, is your energy source in your brewing. And so obviously this is going to be most relevant on the hot side, and that's how you're heating your mash or your strike water and how you're boiling. And there's really kind of 4 primary energy sources that we use, at least in the States, for this. And that would be electricity, natural gas, propane, and then finally steam, which is really more relevant for pro brewers. I don't know of any home steam systems, but steam needs to be generated from some sort of heat source too. So a lot of steam powered systems probably run on natural gas, some probably electric ones, but there are steam services in some legacy cities. Like New York City has the biggest steam service in the United States. I think Philadelphia has a steam service. I think that it's more common in European cities, but it's literally like a utility. You got your water service, you got your electric service, and you have your steam service, and they pipe steam into your building. And that's a very sustainable product, but it's only offered in select places, at least in the United States. You could literally pump steam into your brew house and use it directly in that system. We're going to assume that no residential person in America has that. I don't even know that European residences have access to that, or at least in the extent that you could homebrew with it. But so maybe we can focus on electric versus gas versus propane. And the home brewery, this equation in terms of climate implication is regionally dependent. It depends on what your grid uses. So here in the Pacific Northwest, we have some of the cleanest electric in the country, thanks to a large portion of the generation mix coming from hydro power, which is a renewable energy resource. Similarly, if you're in California and you have rooftop solar, you could use your rooftop solar to effectively power your electric brew kit. And so you have a very clean energy source powering your brew. That being said, if you live in a place with a lot of coal or natural gas powered generation, it could actually be worse to run electricity than to just burn propane or natural gas. So you if you want to be a nerd about it, you got to look into where is your energy coming from, and like the South and coal producing states aren't nearly as good in that regard. In fact, it could even be more climate friendly to drive a hybrid car than an electric car in certain states because their grid is so dirty. When it comes to gas versus propane, I think I actually heard that propane is actually technically has less methane or something in it, and is a little more climate friendly. But the part of the problem is it's a delivered fuel. It's not pumped straight to your home. So there's climate implications associated with getting it there, and then it's just a hassle. So that's why before the electric all-in-one craze, some people started having contractors pipe natural gas for their homebrew kit, so they wouldn't, like Marshall did back in the day, so they wouldn't have to go to the store constantly to acquire more propane. So I think that if you want to nerd out on fuel source, you got to know where you live and understand your options and the grid's electrical mix to make the right decision there.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and then there's also an expense piece of that too, right? Like electric systems are generally more expensive than a propane burner and a kettle, right? I mean, there's a cost that's associated with that too, and then also the generation of those parts and pieces. But again, I love my electric systems, and I think that's certainly where it seems like the trend is going in the future. The main thing that I also like too, this is just kind of me personally, but also like, if I'm burning propane or natural gas, it just feels like I'm burning things, and it smells, and I have to be outside with it, and I have to do it outside. I can't do it inside my house, but with an electric system, as long as I've got adequate ventilation during the boil, I can do things inside my house and never even have to go outside. I also don't have to worry about like gases and stuff and open flames and all these other issues that are there too. But so that's, I think, a good sort of summary of chasing sustainability sustainability throughout ingredients. When we take, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about chasing it through the rest of the process, through the mash, the boil, and of course, cold side applications as well.
One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Making beer is a water-intensive process. 1 barrel of beer can require as much as 10 barrels of water to make. Throw in the raw ingredients like malt steeping and hop irrigation, and it's sort of stunning how much water goes into the process of making beer, right, Jordan?
Yeah, I think that as a rule of thumb, it's maybe 2-to-1 before we've even started chilling at the home level in terms of we need 2 times as much water to produce, half as much drinkable beer. Then you turn your chiller on and it gets out of hand. But there are ways that we can make beer more sustainably and use less ingredients and use our ingredients more efficiently. So we talked about ingredient selection in the last segment. So now why don't we start talking about how to use them more efficiently? And I think that we should start with the mash.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the first thing, obviously, and one of the easiest ways to start is to think about especially if you're making big beers, there's this concept in Europe called party geiling, right? And this is a concept that's really easy. If you're making a big beer that's at 1070 or 1080 or something like that, what is that, 20 Plato? I mean, that's a huge beer, right? That's a big beer. If you're making something that big, usually there's a lot of sugar that's actually left in the grains. So if you do a second runoff of those grains, you can actually make an entirely second beer using the same grains, right? That you've already mashed with. So that one to me is a really, really easy one to think about, in terms of changing your mash process or, doing something to save and recycle rather than just throwing those grains out. You can make a nice light lager. But there's also a whole bunch of other process ingredients that you can change, right? Like we've done a bunch of experiments. One of the reasons why the short and shoddy experiments existed at Brewlosophy is because Marshall and some people have shown that you can still make great beer by shortening your mash length or shortening your boil length, right? So you don't have to mash for the full 60 minutes because somebody 70 years ago decided I'm going to mash for 60 minutes and that's the only way we can do it, right? You need to make sure that you're converting all of your sugars. And once that conversion is done, you can stop heating the mash tun. Or if you're recycling, you can stop running the pump. You can stop sparging whenever you hit your OG. You can do all of these things during the mash to increase your sustainability.
But it goes both ways because if in a world where malt was rare, a longer mash would help you get more malt, extract out of your mash, right? And so by increasing the mash in a world where there's less malt than there is energy, or you can do a stagnant mash that's not heated and just like put a blanket on it or whatever and accept that there's going to be some temperature fall, you can really extend the amount of gravity points you can get out of a given mash by length. There's a few other tricks. You can do a step mash. Inevitably, this could actually extend the mash length, but we tend to see higher OGs associated with the step mash relative to a single infusion for the same amount of grain. taking that one step further, decoction. There is definitely a OG implication with decoction. You're using more energy, you're using more time, and you're also you're concentrating the liquid effectively. I recently brewed a side-by-side, one decoction and one step mash, and it was about a gallon of loss in an approximately 5-gallon batch associated with the decoction, and I did 2 decoctions. But in a world where you're limited in malt and you need to be super efficient, step mashes and decoction are one such way in which you can use less malt to hit the same or higher OG.
Yeah, for sure too. And another thing I think about as well too is like hitting your liquor to grist ratios, right? Having too much water in the mash tun or having not enough water in the mash tun also is going to affect your extract, right? It's going to affect how long and how much water you need in those situations, but also, what extract are you getting out of the grain? So again, extending your grain, making sure that you're getting the maximum amount of extract out of that grain is not only good for your efficiency, right? It's also good for sustainability because you're using an ingredient further. You're going further with it. You can use less of the ingredient to make it to the same extract efficiency standpoint. And, the mash isn't the only place too, though. You think about the boil as well. And I mentioned short and shoddy. Remember that whenever I was first making lagers, I was told you need to be boiling for 90 minutes, if not an hour and 2 hours, right? 90 minutes or 2 hours. And that you have to do that to make a great lager. You've got to mash for 60 minutes. You've got to then boil for 90 minutes and you need to really concentrate the wort and there's Maillard reactions happening and blah, 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 and all this. Also, you need to ferment at low temperatures, right? You need to ferment at 45 Celsius, 45 Fahrenheit, like 12 Celsius, which requires refrigeration in most places, not just like ambient, things. So you have to have energy that requires refrigeration. And so all of these things, like making the traditional lager the traditional way, is kind of expensive and not necessarily sustainable, but it arguably makes a fantastic lager.
Well, and then you get into lagering times, right? Like that's why cheese actually has a pretty high carbon intensity relative to some meats because of the refrigeration time associated with it. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's stay with the boil here for a second. So you make a good point. We can reduce the boil length with minimal impact on beer. Hazy IPA, Saison, these are styles. Why not boil for a half hour? That hour-long boil bittering addition is not necessarily the focus in certain styles, or there's so many other things going on with like crazy amounts of whirlpools or crazy, phenol and ester character that you don't really need that 30 minutes. Time and time again, we've seen 30 minutes is sufficient at the homebrew level in driving off DMS and DMS or driving off the precursor or converting it or whatever the heck it is. We're not having corny beers when we make these 30-minute boils in most elevations in the US with the kind of malts we're using these days. Keep your, don't keep the top on it. That's the big thing is you don't want to accidentally boil it off and then it just all fall back in. But it goes the other way. Just like with mash, we could save on energy that way. But if you were making a super huge beer, I don't know, it might be more carbon friendly to boil it down for several hours, especially if you have clean electricity supplying your electric brew kettle, than to put a ton of malt into it. If you're trying to make a imperial pastry stout with 40 Plato OG or whatever, that requires a ton of malt. And one option would just be to boil it for 8 hours. And if you have clean electric power, that could be way more sustainable than a crazy amount of malt.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point, right? The amount of ingredient in malt in that example, but also hops, right? High alpha hops, things like Magnum, and these bittering hops that you can use that have very high alpha percentages. We're talking like 13, 14, 15% alpha. Those are great because then you're not using as many hops, to achieve that bittering concentration. We talked about, on a couple episodes ago, I think it was, we talked about like using Tettnang, or those German noble varieties like Satz as your bittering hop, that there's something that comes from using those noble varieties as your bittering hop, but you're using more of those hops, which means two things. It means you're using more hop, right? So that's more of the hops that's actually...
I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, but the other thing too is you're using that volume of water, right? Like you're using that volume of water that is being sucked up by the hops. And so maybe there is some flavor flavor impact, but maybe it's good enough to just use a high alpha for bittering. And then the other thing I always think about with hops and bittering is old hops still have bitterness, right? You may not want to use them to dry hop because they might be cheesy or stinky, but you can use them in the boil to add bitterness. You don't have to go and buy new hops. Like if you've got some 2-year-old hops or 3-year-old hops that are in the freezer, I think those might actually still be good and usable for any purpose. But if you don't want to use them in the dry hop or they smell weird, then yeah, throw them in the boil. You can boil with old hops and still achieve bitterness.
Yeah, Steve Thanos' article that came out, I think, this week on some wacky, of course, Steve beer, Yuzu Blonde Ale or something. I noticed his hops were from 2019.
Oh,
and he won an award in a local competition for that beer. And nothing in the article does he describe this is a cheesy mess. I don't know when he brewed that because, sometimes our production schedule, you could brew a beer that doesn't get published for 8 months. But I'm assuming he didn't brew it in 2019 or 2020. And it took us 4 years to publish the article. So I'm a little sketched out on hops that are that old. I don't think I would be willing to brew with 5-year-old hops. But he did it and he won an award. And so it is possible. But that's a great point. You save it for bittering. And if it gets too old, start making lambic.
Yeah, exactly. Start making lambic or something else with it. And then also use hop oils. That's another way too. I actually, that's an interesting question I should ask Jeff Daly or somebody, one of the Haas or YCH folks, or Hopsteiner. Is hop oils how efficient of a process is that? Like is there a lot of waste from it, or is it really just like concentration? Is this a sustainability process or just another way to, get hops into beer? But that'd be something that's interesting, but certainly hop oils save on shipping costs, right? If you don't have to move around hops as much, the oils are cheaper, are less weighty and easier to move around. So it could save on transportation costs. All right. Now,
and maybe storage, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because if you need a giant warehouse to hold all your whole cone hops, you just need a tiny little fridge to hold the oils.
Right, a tiny fridge to hold the oils. Exactly. You don't need to do that. And again, I meant to mention this earlier, but this is a great spot to do it too. If you talk to brewers, and I'm sure if you talk to home brewers as well, the two major sources of energy for a brewery is chilling. That's like the biggest one, right? Keeping beer cold is the biggest expense for most brewers in the United States. But the other one is the heat.
Making beer cold or keeping beer cold?
Keeping beer cold. Yeah, just
so not the chilling, the cold box.
Yeah, the cold box or the glycol, right? Or the the where the fermenters are sitting so that they can stay at the right temperatures, especially if you're doing lagers. If you're doing extended lagering, you got to keep those cold as well. But yeah, keeping the beer cold. Yeah.
So not the heat X, it's the keeping it cold.
Well, heat X is number 2, right? So the heat source is going to be your number 2 energy usage from the brewery, but far and away, and I'm talking like maybe even double your heat cost is your chilling. I mean, think about it. A lot of places in the United States are hot throughout a large part of the year, just like everywhere else, right? Air conditioners Americans love our air conditioning, so that might be a unique American aspect, but we do want to keep beers cold. And everybody wants to keep beer cold, except maybe the Europeans and real ale. And I understand some of that. But, cold beer is a big deal. And that can definitely raise energy costs and be a source of sustainable loss. But for home brewers, your refrigerator probably isn't adding that much to your monthly bill. But if you have to have 2 refrigerators because you need some place to store all of your hops, then yeah, totally, right? That's definitely a place where you can be more sustainable using these oils and reducing the amount of storage that you have or the amount of appliances that you need to keep all of these ingredients.
Right. So, getting back to kind of a chronological process here, we've brewed the beer, we've boiled the beer, and maybe we added some oil at flame out, but we got to chill the beer. So there's a few different options here to be more sustainable, and basically we want to reduce water use. So whether that's an immersion chiller, a plate chiller, just making sure that you have an appropriate size chiller that's as efficient as possible. I gather that the Jaded brand immersion chillers are way more efficient and that they can chill it super fast and thus use less water than a standard coil chiller. Super excited to finally get one of those someday because I'm using way too much water with my standard coil that my old brew system came with. Also, plate chillers. The bigger the plate chiller, the less water, the colder you can get it. I assume it's using less water too, right? Because if you're just constantly recirculating and chilling in a small, thin plate chiller, you're going to use more water to get it where you want it to be. So the more plates is going to ultimately help you use less water. And then you can go Aussie style and just not chill it and put it in a cube and then pitch yeast the next day. Or I guess you could use low chill requiring yeast strains like Kveik that you don't need to chill it too much. There's also kind of the old school method of just pitching the next day, even without a cube.
Totally. That's kind of what I was going to say too. That last method, I use that all the time whenever I was in Texas, mostly because the groundwater that I was using for chilling wouldn't get the beer cold enough unless I did some sort of pre-immersion in ice. And that just got to be, it's just me not planning well, and I never had ice on occasion whenever I needed to brew. But in any event, when I couldn't get that water down, I was constantly putting beer into my fermentation chamber that was in the high 80s Fahrenheit or 90, right? So we're talking about high 20s and low 30s in Celsius. So we're talking about warm beer, and microbes and things can grow in that. But if your sanitation practices are good, that's totally an appropriate way. So instead of chilling that beer all the way down to pitching temperature, you can chill it several degrees higher and then put it in your fermentation chamber to chill the rest of the way. That would definitely save some water. But one of the big things about chilling is the appropriate size chiller. So I suspect, Jordan, what you're saying with your older brewing system, the chiller that you got versus the jaded has a higher surface area. So exactly what you said with the plate chiller. The smaller plate chillers, you're not able to get as cold as fast. It's all because of surface area. The surface area is the temperature exchange. Higher surface area plate chiller, faster that you can cool things down, less water that you're having to use to chill everything. Same thing with the jaded immersion chillers, and then the basic brewing chiller that you can get in any homebrew store. So that's the key thing to think about, and that can definitely reduce the amount of water that you're sending and dumping out into the ground. But if you're dumping that water out into the ground, you're also doing something that you could be saving energy on, right? Save that water, especially that first stuff that comes out that's really warm and hot. That's great for cleaning liquid, right? Because you need your cleaning liquid to be warm. So if you don't have that hose running into a bucket or collecting that water someplace, you really have a missed opportunity there to save on your water consumption, right? Because then I can fill up almost an entire 5-gallon bucket of warm water that I can then use for cleaning the fermenter, the mash tun, the hoses, pumps, all that sort of stuff. And oftentimes too, what I've started to do now is realize hey, I can also clean my draft lines out of that water as well too. So that's something I wasn't doing very regularly. I realized I need to do that more regularly. And so that's something that you can do. If you've got this cleaning solution around, you can use the cleaning solution in multiple applications. You don't have to just use it one time, right? It's not like I don't have to make 5 gallons to then clean my boil kettle and my mash tun, and then when the fermenter needs to be cleaned, I need to make another 5 gallons. It kind of depends. You can let things stack up. Clean your kegs whenever you're cleaning your brewing equipment, whatever. All these different efficiencies that can help you save water.
Yeah, I recently tried collecting the water because I had felt kind of shaming myself for not normally doing that. And I brought out a 5-gallon keg and a 3-gallon keg, and they were instantly filled. And I was doing side-by-side batches, and the first one wasn't even close to chilled. So it's there is so much waste if you don't have a super efficient chiller like the Hydra, et cetera, from Jaded. So is creatively reusing that water, watering the garden, filling your hot tub, or making lemonade with it. I don't know, but there's definitely a lot of water that's going down the drain. And then, really sustainable breweries are recapturing that and repurposing it. But let's move on from water. So one thing to think about here is losses. You got dead space in your mash tun, et cetera. So that's one thing I try to do is get every drop. And I don't like to ferment with a bunch of trub, but you could. It remains to be seen what the sweet spot is, because 0 trub is not necessary, and 50% trub isn't necessarily bad in terms of the amount of trub that's in your kettle that makes into your fermenter. But chasing all those little losses, emptying out your hoses into your fermenter, et cetera, and just making sure that no drop is lost.
Yeah, that's the key thing, right? Making sure that no drop is lost. And it's important to think about that with chilling, right? If you're just running water out off into the ground somewhere, obviously that's the easiest way to see like water's being lost there. But water's stuck at the bottom of your mash tun, it's stuck at the bottom of your kettle, it's stuck in your chiller dead space. There's still water that's stuck in your chiller, right? Even you doing the best that you can running things through, especially if you're using a plate chiller. There's all these like nooks and crannies. So flushing things out, watching the bottom of your fermenter, but tracking through all of these processes will help you get and dial in the amount of water that you need to use for your brewing system. And then the goal is to make it more efficient, right? We're always talking about, I have so many times people are like, I want to hit this higher extract efficiency. Let's also hit water use efficiency as well too, right? Like, and see what you can do there. Challenge yourself. See if you can see if you can do as good as like Anheuser-Busch and some of the big breweries, or like New Belgium and Sierra Nevada, the places that reclaim their water and reuse it, so that they've reduced that 1-to-10 ratio down to like 1-to-3. So if you can make a 5-gallon batch of beer with 15 gallons of water, that would be incredible, right? That sounds kind of to me impossible as I'm thinking about my brewing processes. But wow, if you could do that, that would be awesome.
Well, in theory, the water could be infinitely sustainable, right? Because especially if you were if you needed to filter your water for your brew day, then if you were filtering your water in line to your chiller, you could capture that if you were brewing enough and brew with it the next day, right? So some goes to sanitizer production, some goes to cleaner production, some goes to strike water. So, but let's move on from water. We talked a lot about water. So this is kind of a process, kind of an ingredient choice. It's kind of a hybrid here, is repitching yeast. There is no reason you have to buy a new pack of yeast every time, as to the dismay of our sponsor, Imperial Yeast. And this is definitely, if you're brewing enough, it's one way to save energy. Save energy in terms of the production of yeast at a factory, but also saving on ingredient costs and saving on just everything, right? Because media is used to grow yeast at the lab. And so we have media. It's the beer that we just brewed. And even at the homebrew level, you can push this stuff 5 generations, no problem, with no ill effects. It's really easy. We're already clean, right? We know how to clean things. We know how to sanitize things. Do that and put it in a jar and then use it the next time. You can use a online calculator to estimate how much viability is left. So always make sure you mark the strain, the generation, and the date that you jarred it, so that you know what you're working with next time you go to use it. Keep it in a fridge, not a freezer, not room temp. And the rule of thumb I use is 1 milliliter of pure slurry is 1 billion cells. 2 billion cells. So if you have a jar of slurry and you can see it's stratified, it's settled out, and you have 200 milliliters of pure white slurry in the bottom, because a lot of jars have milliliter markings on them, and then you have 200 milliliters of wort on top of that. That 200 milliliters of pure white slurry at the bottom is roughly equivalent to 400 billion cells, assuming 100% viability. So you go into your yeast calculator and you say, I've got 4 packs of 100 billion cell count yeast, and my jar date is 20 days ago, and boom, it'll tell you have 340 estimated billion cells. And so by saving yeast, you can brew great beer, and this rule of thumb calculation of 1 milliliter equals 2 billion cells is a super easy rule of thumb, and it served me very well for many years. I'm probably over pitching a little bit. I think it's actually 1.2 at a 40% dilution is the estimation. So I'm kind of fudging the numbers there, but pitching a little high has served me very well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, reusing yeast, also, pitching directly on a yeast cake, those are things that you can do. But these are sort of getting into the fermentation metrics. And again, one of the ones we talked about at the top of the show for fermentation is CO2 recapture, right? That CO2 is just blowing off into the air. Yeah, that's increasing your CO2 emissions, right? That's like a direct increase in that. But you can recapture that CO2. You can use it to purge kegs. Use that system that we talked about in the feedback, right? That Marshall used to use, or that that he still uses with the Brewloon lock. That you hook up your fermenter to a keg and recapture the CO2. Use that to either purge out the keg or use it to purge out the keg. Push water, deaerated water, or push sanitizer through that keg into another keg, and then you've got a fully purged keg that's ready to go for your beer to come in that's got CO2 inside it. That way you don't have to purge it and waste CO2 from the canister, right? There's all of these sorts of things. And then even from a packaging perspective too, right? Reusing bottles, if you're bottling, making sure that your kegs aren't leaking, right? Maintaining your kegs so that, how many times have you come into the brewery or into your kegerator, Jordan, and the seal wasn't set or there was a poppet depressed and you've blown off a whole 5-pound, CO2 thing, right? It's happened so many times to me. So like making sure that you're maintaining those O-rings and fittings and using some keg lube and all that sort of stuff can also improve your recapture of CO2.
Well, also, we could use our CO2 to purge the next keg, but we can also let it stay in solution and carbonate the beer. And so I'm a big fan of spunding lagers. I find that you do get a wonderful head formation and retention, and it's free CO2. And for a lager, it captures more sulfur and can be appropriate in certain German styles. So spunding is definitely the most sustainable way you could possibly carbonate your beer. And you can do it in bottles if you're feeling risky, and I would recommend using a thick brown Belgian bottle to do this. But you can package your beer in bottles early, and a forced fermentation test would be one best practice to know your anticipated FG. Just do the math to know that this much fermentation or attenuation is expected, which will get me at the volume of CO2 I want. And at that point, in a tilt hydrometer or Kegland floating hydrometer will help you follow this without wasting a bunch of beer to figure out the FG. You can just go ahead and put it straight into bottles, cap them with no priming sugar, and it will effectively spund in the bottle. I've done it before. It works great.
Yeah, that's a great idea, right? Use that. Spunding is also really cool too. That's one of those things that I've never really played around with much because I always fermented in, fermenters that weren't super pressure stable, right? But if you've got some sort of pressure stable fermenter, like if you're fermenting in a keg, right, like Jordan has talked about on multiple episodes, or if you've got one of the new fermenters that's capable of reaching several psi, that's a great way to recapture CO2. Use that CO2 that's just escaping off into the atmosphere to carbonate the beer, which you're going to have to do anyway. All right, Jordan. Well, I think the one last topic that I wanted to talk about is I think we've sort of weaved this throughout the show, but I wanted to put it here right at the end as like the summary thing. Chasing sustainability. If you want to increase the sustainability of your process, how do you do that?
Listen to this episode.
Yeah. Right.
As we've explored, there are ways to improve sustainability at every single piece of the process. And the more we can do there, the lower our carbon footprint as home brewers and pro brewers will be. And that's a good thing for the planet and, for the future. So I think that thinking hard about it, and it's kind of a fun challenge. How amazing of a beer can I make being as sustainable as possible?
Right.
The sky's the limit.
Yeah. Can I still make great beer by also like reducing my water usage or reducing my energy uses, And so I think that's the key thing that I wanted to talk about here is making sustainability a goal. It'd be fun to chase this, to see if how much water do I actually use? I want to write it down on a piece of paper and know how much water I use in my brewing process. And then I want to see if I can creep that down and still make the same quality beer. So I think that's a personal challenge that I might try, coming up soon, and then maybe you as well too, Jordan. But is there anything else that you wanted to add talking about chasing sustainability through the brewing process?
I just encourage everyone to really be efficient when they can. There's a lot of opportunities to make this hobby and this industry more sustainable, and we're all a part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jordan and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. We'll see y'all then.
The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.